In the winter of 1942, the Empire of Japan seemed invincible. Its armies had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, all had fallen. In America, the shock of Pearl Harbor had given way to a grim, demoralizing reality. Gloom descended over the nation. German U-boats were sinking ships just off the American coast. Britain was being strangled and the Axis powers looked unstoppable. The Japanese public was told their home islands were a sacred, untouchable fortress protected by the divine will of the emperor. They were told the war was a distant affair, fought and won far from their shores. They were wrong. America's answer wouldn't come from a massive fleet or a great army. It would come from 16 lone bombers. And it all hinged on a plan so audacious, so desperate, that even its creators thought it was a suicide mission. This is the story of how a handful of planes, launched from a place they were never meant to be, exposed the vulnerability of the Japanese mainland, panicked its military, and shattered an empire's morale. This is the story of the Doolittle Raid. Section 1. The Problem, an Unbroken Empire. To really get why this raid was so crazy, you have to go back to the bleakest days of early 1942. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military disaster. It was a deep psychological blow. The pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet now lay in ruins. For the first time since the War of 1812, an attack on American soil was no longer a theory but a painful reality. In the weeks that followed, the news only got worse. Japanese forces were moving with a speed and ferocity that stunned the Allies, and their battle flag, the rising sun, was going up over one Allied stronghold after another. The fall of Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, was a humiliating defeat for the British. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops were locked in a desperate, doomed defense on the Bataan Peninsula that would end in the infamous Bataan Death March. A sense of helplessness was creeping across the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew something had to be done to fight back against this story of unending defeat. On December 21, 1941, just 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, his directive to his top military chiefs was simple: bomb Japan as soon as possible. He knew the main goal wasn't massive destruction. It was to give American morale a vital shot in the arm and send a clear signal to Japan that this would not be a one-sided war. It was about landing a punch, however small, to show that America was still in the fight. But the problem seemed impossible. The U.S. had no air bases within striking distance of Japan. Our heaviest bombers, like the B-17, just didn't have the range, and carrier planes were designed for short-range naval combat, not bombing mainland cities. The Japanese military knew this. They had built their entire defense around the vastness of the Pacific, with a line of picket boats patrolling hundreds of miles out to sea. Any approaching enemy fleet would be spotted, intercepted, and destroyed long before it could get close. The Japanese mainland, they confidently believed, was an impregnable fortress. This feeling of invincibility was everywhere in Japanese society. Propaganda portrayed the war as a sacred mission. The string of victories seemed to prove it. The military leadership had promised the people that they would never feel the sting of war on their own soil. Shattering that promise would mean shattering the very foundation of their confidence. The question for Roosevelt and his commanders wasn't why they should strike Japan, but how. The answer would come not from a traditional battle plan, but from a brilliant, out-of-the-box idea. Section 2. The Audacious Solution. The idea came from Navy Captain Francis Lowe. On January 10, 1942, he was at an airfield in Norfolk, Virginia, where the outline of an aircraft carrier deck had been painted on a runway. As he watched twin-engine Army bombers practicing takeoffs and landings, a radical thought hit him. Could a land-based bomber with its much longer range take off from a real carrier? It was a concept that flew in the face of all military doctrine. Lowe took his idea to Admiral Ernest King, the formidable chief of naval operations. King, a man known for his aggressive style, immediately saw the potential. This was exactly the kind of thinking America needed. The plan became a joint Army-Navy project. The bombers wouldn't land back on the carrier. That was impossible. This would be a one-way trip. They would launch from the sea, bomb Japan, and then, hopefully, fly onto friendly airfields in China. The aircraft they chose was the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. It was one of the few Army bombers with a wingspan narrow enough to potentially clear a carrier's command tower. But even its standard range of about 1,300 miles was nowhere near enough for the 2,400-mile journey they had in mind. To lead this mission and solve its countless problems, the Army turned to one of the most famous aviators in the world, Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. Doolittle was a true original, a champion boxer, a daredevil air racer, and he also happened to have a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a master of the science of flight. He understood the limits of an aircraft and, more importantly, how to push right past them. He was the perfect man for an impossible job. Doolittle got to work immediately. The B-25s had to be radically modified. To save weight, they were stripped of much of their defensive armament. The top-secret Norden bomb site was taken out. It was useless for low-level bombing and too valuable to risk falling into enemy hands. It was replaced with a simple homemade aiming device. In a clever bit of deception, the tail guns were replaced with broomsticks painted black, meant to make Japanese fighters think twice before attacking from behind. But the most critical change was the fuel. The B-25's standard capacity was boosted with extra fuel tanks in the bomb bay, the crawlway, and where the lower gun turret used to be, bringing the total to over 1,100 gallons. These planes were now effectively flying fuel tanks, heavy, sluggish, and incredibly dangerous. With the planes ready, Doolittle needed crews. He asked for volunteers from the 17th Bombardment Group, telling them only that the mission was extremely hazardous. Every man he asked volunteered. They began intense, secret training at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing something no bomber pilot had ever done before. Taking off from a runway just 500 feet long. Over and over they pushed their heavy bombers into the air, in impossibly short distances until the dangerous maneuver became second nature. By the end of March 1942, 16 modified B-25s and their 80 crewmen were ready. On April 1st, they were loaded by crane onto the deck of the USS Hornet in California. It was a bizarre sight. Massive Army bombers packed so tightly on the flight deck that none of the Hornet's own planes could operate. On April 2nd, the Hornet slipped out of San Francisco Bay and sailed west, carrying America's desperate hope on its deck. Section 3, the point of no return. Aboard the USS Hornet, the tension was thick. The airmen knew their chances were slim. Doolittle was brutally honest, telling his men that he fully expected some planes wouldn't make it. In his own mind, he thought losing all 16 aircraft was a real possibility, and that he'd be facing a court-martial if he ever made it back. The plan was to launch about 450 miles from Japan, which would give them just enough fuel to hit their targets and press on to airfields in China. But things went wrong. Early on the morning of April 18, 1942, while the task force was still over 650 miles from Japan, much farther out than planned, a lookout spotted a Japanese picket boat. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire and sank it, but it was too late. The picket boat had managed to radio a warning to Japan. The element of surprise was gone. Admiral Bull Halsey, the task force commander, had a terrible choice to make. Continuing west meant sailing into a trap, risking two of America's few precious carriers. The risk was too great. Halsey gave the order, "Launch planes to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command. Good luck and God bless you." The raid was on, but it was happening 10 hours early and almost 200 miles farther out than anyone had planned. For the pilots, this was the worst possible news. Those extra miles meant their fuel reserves were shot. The already slim chances of reaching the airfields in China had just vanished. They'd be lucky to even make it to the Chinese coast. The weather was awful. Waves crashed over the Hornet's bow and the carrier pitched violently in the heavy seas. At 8:20 a.m., Jimmy Doolittle revved his engines. He had just 467 feet of runway before a sheer drop into the Pacific. He released his brakes and the heavy bomber roared down the wet deck. For a heart-stopping moment, the plane dipped so low its wheels almost touched the water before Doolittle managed to claw his way into the sky. One by one, the other 15 bombers followed. Each takeoff was a life-or-death drama played out for the cheering Navy crew. Miraculously, all 16 made it. They dropped down to wavetop level to stay under Japanese radar and flew on. They were alone, with no fighter escort, heading for the most heavily defended airspace in the world. When they reached the Japanese coast, the surprise was almost total. The Japanese military had received the warning, but they were confused. They were expecting carrier planes much closer to shore. The sight of twin-engine B-25s was something they thought was impossible. As the American planes flew inland, civilians on the ground waved, thinking they were their own aircraft. The raiders split up, heading for targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. They flew so low that crews could see the shocked faces of people in the streets. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, but it was wild and inaccurate. Japanese fighters scrambled, but the B-25s were too low, too fast, and too scattered. The bombs hit military and industrial targets, oil tanks, steel mills, and naval yards. The physical damage was minor, but the real target was never just steel and concrete. It was the mind of the Japanese nation. For the first time, the war had come home. Air raid sirens wailed over Tokyo. The untouchable fortress had been breached. Section 4, the aftermath, survival and sacrifice. With Japan behind them, the airmen faced their next impossible task, crossing the East China Sea on fumes. As night fell, a fierce storm blew in. Flying in darkness and driving rain, their engines began to sputter and die. Most crews were forced to bail out into the blackness, parachuting into unknown territory. Others, like Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot of the ruptured Bastogne, had an injured crewman and had to attempt a brutal crash landing on a beach that nearly tore his own leg off. Jimmy Doolittle and his crew bailed out over a mountainous region, with Doolittle himself landing in a paddy full of night soil. He was despondent, convinced the loss of all 16 planes meant the mission was a failure. Only later, after linking up with his other men, did he begin to grasp what they had truly accomplished. Of the 16 planes, 15 crashed or were abandoned over China. One crew, critically low on fuel, diverted north and landed in the Soviet Union, where they were interned for over a year before escaping. For the crews in China, survival now depended entirely on the kindness of local civilians and resistance fighters. Despite the immense danger, Chinese villagers guided the Americans, fed them, hid them from Japanese patrols, and helped them on the long journey to safety. In the end, 69 of the 80 raiders made it back to American lines. But their survival came at a terrible price. Enraged and humiliated, the Japanese military launched a brutal reprisal campaign in the areas where the crews had landed. It was an exercise in pure terror. Japanese troops swept through the region, burning towns and executing civilians who might have helped the Americans. In a horrifying act of biological warfare, the infamous Unit 731 was reportedly deployed to spread cholera, typhoid, and plague, poisoning wells and food supplies. By the end of the campaign, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians had been massacred, all for the crime of helping the American airmen. Not all the raiders escaped. 8 men were captured. They were tortured and put through mock trials. Accused of war crimes, 3 of them, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad in October 1942. Their deaths were a grim reminder of the high price of the raid. Section 5, the shattered morale. Back in Tokyo, the reaction inside the military high command was stunned disbelief. Admiral Nagano, Chief of the Navy's General Staff, reportedly muttered, "This shouldn't happen." The commander of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was so shaken he stayed in his cabin for a full day, refusing to see anyone. The raid was a colossal loss of face. The Imperial Navy had failed in its most sacred duty, to protect the Emperor. The physical damage was tiny, but the psychological shockwave was immense. The myth of invincibility, a cornerstone of Japanese morale, had been shattered. A seed of doubt was planted. If the military couldn't protect Tokyo, what else were they wrong about? This forced a drastic shift in Japanese strategy. 4 entire army fighter groups were pulled back from the front lines to defend the home islands, weakening Japan's offensive power at a critical moment. More importantly, the raid galvanized a humiliated Admiral Yamamoto. He became obsessed with destroying the American carriers that had launched the attack. A plan to strike the U.S. base at Midway Atoll, designed to lure the American fleet into a final decisive battle, had been debated for weeks. After the Doolittle raid, all opposition vanished. The raid gave Yamamoto the push he needed to get the operation approved. He thought he was setting a trap for the Americans. In reality, driven by the sting of the raid, he was leading his own navy into one. In the United States, the reaction was pure joy. The country, starved for good news, erupted in celebration. When asked where the bombers had come from, President Roosevelt slyly smiled and said only, "Shangri-La," the name of a fictional paradise from a popular novel. The clever misdirection fueled the public's delight. The raid was hailed as America's answer to Pearl Harbor. War bond sales surged. The psychological lift was immeasurable. Jimmy Doolittle, the man who expected a court-martial, returned home a national hero. He was promoted 2 ranks to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. The consequences of the raid came to a head just 6 weeks later at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese fleet sailed right into an ambush set by the U.S. Navy, which had cracked their codes. American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's best carriers were turned into blazing wrecks. A 4th was sunk later that day. It was a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, and it was a battle that happened because 16 American bombers had forced Japan's hand. Conclusion. The Doolittle raid was a mission of paradoxes, a tactical failure that became a stunning strategic victory. Its physical damage was minimal, but its psychological impact was devastating. It resulted in the loss of every single plane, yet it was celebrated as one of the war's greatest triumphs. The 16 B-25s that roared off the deck of the USS Hornet didn't win the war, but they proved the war could be won. They shattered the myth of an invulnerable Japan and provoked a fatal mistake that led directly to the turning point at Midway. They delivered a message not just with bombs, but with their very presence in the skies over Tokyo. The message was clear. America, though bloodied, was not broken. No ocean was wide enough to protect an aggressor from the consequences of their actions. The legacy is complex, forever shaded by the horrific price paid by the Chinese people. But at its core, this is a story about how a single audacious act can change the course of history. It shows how 16 airplanes and the unwavering courage of their crews could lift the spirit of a nation, shake the confidence of an empire, and light a fire of hope in the darkest days of the war.